Thank you very much. Good morning and welcome to our session this morning. My name is Dixon Omondi. I come from the National Democratic Institute, and I've been asked to facilitate this session that will be looking at social movements and alternatives to political parties. In many respects, this is a continuation of the discussion that we had yesterday on mechanisms of representation. And I'm pleased to be joined on this distinguished panel by two speakers. And so I will start by introducing them. On my far right is Michael Rubestad. Michael is a substitute member of the Electoral Review Board of Sweden. I find his bio fascinating because he's done all the things that I've never done. His love around music, music production, aesthetics, technology, and methodology. But beyond that, I think he's also had a lot of work around elections, and so Michael will be one of our speakers this morning. I'm also pleased to be joined by Anne Scott Timmer, who is seated in the center. Anne is the Vice Justice of the Arizona Supreme Court of the United States of America. She has a distinguished career in legal practice and has a Doctor of Law in Law from the Arizona State University. And so I'm also pleased that she will be here to share with us her experiences. The sessions yesterday, in many respects, provided what I think is a very good preface to the discussion that we are going to have today. I think there was a very interesting discussion around growing dissatisfaction with democracy and institutions, political institutions. And I need not go back to those particular statistics, but to say that those of us who work in democracy now have a better understanding of what some of the drivers of that dissatisfaction is. We have seen how economic crisis and growing social inequalities across the world has fueled growing dissatisfaction with political institutions and political parties. Secondly, we have seen how digital revolution and particularly the growth in technology has transformed how citizens access information, how citizens interact with each other, and importantly also how they interact with governments and the expectations that they have of governments. And thirdly, we see that citizens perceive politicians to be self-interested and often mobilizing support around elections with particularly no intention of fulfilling the promises that they've made. The American researcher and scholar Tom Carothers at the Carnegie, many years back, about a decade back, wrote an interesting book focused on political parties as a weak link in democracy. And one of the things he talked about was what he called the standard lament, which outlined disillusionment with political parties as institutions. And some of the things he said are that, one, political parties are perceived by citizens to be dominated by corrupt and self-interested politicians. Two, that they generally fail to provide an effective alternative, policy alternative, or ideology to citizens. Thirdly, that parties don't really prioritize national interest. In fact, he was pointing out to the continual squabbling between parties and internally to parties. Fourthly, he talked about the failure to consistently engage citizens, which I particularly find very interesting and relevant if you think about the topic of the day, social movements, and how we have found other groups, social groups, engaging citizens much more robustly than political parties. He also talked about the weak ability of political parties to govern and oftentimes the poor performance when they are trusted with government. So that is the context of the discussion today, that we look at political parties traditionally as institutions that are theoretically expected to mobilize citizen participation, aggregate citizen interests, and reflect that in the politics of the country, but they are failing to do that. And so what are the alternatives that have emerged? In the discussions yesterday, we discussed independent candidates as one alternative that we've seen. Social movements is another, and we've generally seen an idea, particularly around social mobilization theory, that posits social movements as competing with political parties. And so that's part of the discussion underlying that we're going to have today, To what extent are social movements effective as alternatives to political parties? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages of social movements in this particular context? From a definitional perspective, of course, there are many different ways of conceptualizing social movements. I propose a working definition that looks at them as informal networks that are based on shared beliefs and solidarity, and that mobilize around conflictual issues, often through protests, and so, you know, if you think about Occupy Wall Street, if you think about, you know, in Sudan and in the Arab Spring, groups that have emerged around those to mobilize citizens around certain interests. So the question that we are going to put today to the speakers, who will have about 7 minutes each to speak on these issues and afterwards allow us to engage in discussion, is to really examine the extent to which these social movements exist as a credible, as an effective alternative to political parties on the one hand, and secondly, if there are other alternatives for us to look at this discussion. And one of the models that has been proposed is not to see them as alternatives that seek to replace political parties, but to try to think about what are the inherent advantages, what are the achievements of social movements, and how do those interact with political parties, and particularly the challenges that we've seen that have led to growing public distrust and disillusionment, disaffection with political parties. Carothers and many others note that despite these many problems, it is difficult to conjure any other image of democracy, a genuine democracy, without political parties. So despite these problems, and that informs the work that some of us like National Democratic Institute do, that we still believe that political parties have a very critical role to play in driving and building genuine democracies. So in this sense, therefore, we think of political parties as very important in terms of organizing and structuring political choices, and certainly in terms of providing a cohesive approach to the governing function. So to transition, therefore, we had a number of questions specifically that I would like the speakers to reflect on as they guide this discussion. First, what has been the role of social movements in politics, and what effects have they had on citizen participation, representation, and equality? Secondly, is to reflect on the effect of the emergence of these movements on electoral administration regulation. And I found that a pretty difficult job myself, and so it will be interesting to hear both their views, but also your views as participants in this particular session. How have these new forms of representation emerged? So to go back to Carothers, you know, it is difficult to see any genuine democracy without political parties or similar institutions. Are there similar institutions that have emerged? Are social movements those institutions that have emerged? And are they legislated? How does the law provide for these particular institutions? From your perspective, what are the benefits and disadvantages of these social movements? And particularly as related to political and electoral rights, which is, I think, one of the underlying themes that brings us here today. And critically, you know, how do jurisdictional electoral authorities, electoral management bodies relate to these social movements? In many places, the formal requirement to participate in politics is registration, to be institutions that are formally guided by law. Social movements often are not. We've seen in a number of jurisdictions they attempt to transform themselves into political parties, and actually there are a number of successful examples of social movements transforming to political parties. But really, how do electoral management bodies, how do groups and people gathered here relate to these political parties? So let me begin by then inviting Michael to offer us his thoughts for 7 minutes, and then we'll ask Anna to also do so, and then open up to the rest of you all. Michael.
Okay, first of all, good morning to you all, and thank you for the opportunity to be here, and thank you for this kind presentation. In my 7 minutes, I will give a brief presentation of how social movements affect and have historically influenced democracy and politics in my home country, Sweden, as a basis for further discussions. I myself represent a political party that started out as a social movement, for today being the second largest, if not the largest party in Sweden. An ordinary Friday in August 2018, about a month before the election, 16-year-old Greta Thunberg sat outside the Swedish parliament with a sign that reads, "School strike for climate." She had two well-known parents and the help of a public relations agency, which is the big difference between most others who protest week after week outside the parliament without any success. But at the same time, her message was so-called right in time, and the rest is, as you say, history. Today, Greta Thunberg has millions of followers all over the world and youngsters who strike under the slogan Fridays for Future. And no matter what you consider about the climate or Thunberg as a person, there is no doubt that she is something of a living definition of a social movement. Because of this movement, not only is Sweden's political conversations dominated by discussions about the climate, but also large parts of the world's countries have got the climate debate considerably higher up on the agenda. Now, what would have happened if Greta had been 18 years old instead of 16 and had formed a political party instead? What will happen if Greta prepares for the next election in 2022 and at the age of 20 runs for parliament? Would she benefit from turning her movement into a political party or not? In order to be able to say something about it, we will look at two social movements in Sweden that did just this trip, but first some background facts about Sweden in general. There. Sweden is a small country with just over 10 million inhabitants. We have elections every 4 years since 1994. Approximately 7.5 million people are entitled to vote, and of these, approximately 6.5 million actually do vote, which is just over 87%. In the 2018 elections for parliament, 29 parties registered, and 8 of them were elected, which were the same parties as in the previous election. Worth knowing is that the only thing required to run for parliament is 1,000 signatures and at least one candidate. The Swedish parliament consists of 349 seats, and the threshold for obtaining representation is 4% out of the vote, which corresponds to around 260,000 people. Let's see now. There. If a party receives 1% of the votes, corresponding to around 65,000 people, the party receives financial support and free ballots in the next election. In 2018, the party became the third largest in the country with over 17% of the votes. That would be the Sweden Democrats and the party that I represent. In 1889, the Social Democrats were formed in Sweden after a number of social movements came together to form a political party instead. With 8 hours of working day and equal voting rights for women as their two main issues and questions, the party became very popular among workers and women very quickly. Two issues that are typical of a social movement because it benefits the people and are not as interesting to the already established parties or from a purely economic perspective. After Sweden went into an economic depression after the end of the First World War, Sweden for the first time got a socialist government instead of a conservative one, which retained power until 1973, with the exception of a short period in the early 1930s, when the Social Democrats were included in a coalition government with a conservative prime minister. On 3 occasions, the Social Democrats even had their own majority with over 50% of the vote. In 1988, however, something happened. Several of the values which Sweden has been built upon for about 100 years, which can be summarized briefly by do your duty and demand your right, began to collapse. The feeling of Swedish solidarity and the community decreased, and social welfare deteriorated. This led to several parties being formed, either by breaking out of existing parties or, as in the case of my party, that a number of social movements joined together to form a new political party, in this case the Sweden Democrats. Not much unlike what happened some 100 years earlier. Gathered around the question of restoring what Sweden once was, the Sweden Democrats grew as a party, and in 2002 the party received more than 1% and thus receives financial support and ballots in the upcoming elections. In 2010 the party passed the 4% barrier and was elected to parliament for the first time and has since grown with rocket speed in every election. In the latest poll, as you can see here, of October 2019, the Sweden Democrats are second largest, and in the category of workers, even the largest party. Trying to get to the next slide here. There. The Swedish Democrats are not a part of the government, but has the balance of power in Swedish politics. In another survey, also from October 2019, 61% of the voters believe that other parties should cooperate with the Swedish Democrats in those cases where they have the same opinion on this issue, on one issue, sorry. But only one of the other 7 parties has so far announced that they are willing to speak with the Swedish Democrats. Not infrequently, the Swedish Social Democrats have chosen to name the party with various insults to scare the voters from giving them their votes. This has been going on since 1988, when the party was originally formed, which has resulted in something of an actual fear of talking to representatives of the party. But just as when the party was a social movement, this response from the established parties only strengthened the party's position with more voters in elections after elections. So, as for one of the questions, what have been the factors and reasons behind social movements in the 21st century? Next slide again, please, if someone could help me. It doesn't seem to work from here. And how do they relate to democratic disaffection? In Sweden, the major factors are not democratic disaffection per se, but rather disaffection with the policy pursued. In a world where we can now access information from the internet and alternative media ourselves, people have begun to form their own perceptions and become more critical of the source compared to when they accepted the image of reality presented by governing politicians and state-funded public service. With this new information, it has been understood that not everything is necessarily the same as in the image presented. There are other facts, factors, and priorities for the people to consider. On the other hand, there's a democratic problem with the autonomous groupings, which mean that a certain type of opinions should not be presented, and thus are prepared to forcibly prevent these opinions from being expressed or forcibly make people change their opinion. Here, 4 out of 10 people in Sweden believe that democracy is threatened. For this reason, the Sweden Democrats are always underestimated in the polls compared to the actual results. Furthermore, there's a general dissatisfaction with the fact that the parties that are not a part of the governing majority do not receive any adherence to their policies, which is perceived as not respecting the vote of the people, which in turn means that people stemming from social movements tend to grow even more. As an example, the Swedish Democrats are excluded from all types of political discussions across party borders. 2 of the central parties in Swedish politics, the Center Party and the Liberals, have even chosen to renounce their own politics and have chosen to actively support a left-wing government only to prevent the Swedish Democrats from gaining any influence, which they did in first the December agreement in 2014 and then again in the January agreement now in 2018. The fact that I am here representing Sweden as a Swedish Democrat and all by myself is actually highly unexpected and probably has something to do with the fact that the trip here took over 28 hours. Of course, all of this is something that needs to be discussed in more depth, but unfortunately there is not so much more time for my 7 minutes. But I do hope I have given you some background and food for thought on how social movements have affected democracy and the political conversation in Sweden, as an example. Had the Social Democrats not been formed out of social movements some 130 years ago, and the Sweden Democrats some 30 years ago, we probably would have had a completely different Sweden than we have today, with things like IKEA, the Nobel Prize, Volvo, and Greta Thunberg, for example. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Michael, for what is a very excellent exposition and practical examples of how a social movement has transformed itself into a political party and the factors that have driven that in the context of Sweden. So with that, I now want to turn it to Ann Scott-Timmer to share with us and see whether we can also get a good example from the US.
Oh, great. Thank you. Well, good morning, and I'm very pleased to be here. In doing so, I'm really not drawing on my judicial experience, rather that I'm really reaching back to my undergraduate degree in political science, something that's always been a love of mine, particularly because, in my view, political science, political parties are really all about people. And so some of the examples I'm going to use come from the US because that's what I'm familiar with, obviously. But I think it really translates to every country and every representative country in this room because it is all about people and human nature and how we react. I thought an interesting way to relate my points, which are the impact of social movements on political parties and in general. I think we can learn from that or reflect on. Both of them about the same time, both in the US. One was the first one is the Occupy Wall Street movement. I don't know if any of you had heard of that, but it came about in 2011, ironically pushed by a Canadian group that urged folks to occupy Lower Manhattan and the Wall Street area. Their central protest was surrounded a lot of anger over the Great Recession and how it was handled in the aftermath in the US, whereas President Obama's administration was seen to have bailed out a lot of the big business, big corporate America, the banks, and frankly the very folks that were part of the problem that caused the recession. They're bailed out, yet the people are left standing. Their mantra, their call, so to speak, is we are the 99%. And I think you've heard that likely reverberate through the decades since. And it was really setting up the difference in the treatment of the 99% and the 1% income earners in the US. And some real dissension about the influence seen by many, the over-influence of corporate America on corporate governance. And that was the protest. It's interesting what they did. They actually did, of course, occupy areas, a park in New York for a couple months before it all dissipated, but it became a little city there. The way they communicated, they did use social media to get the word out and to communicate, but not entirely. And I think that is one of the lessons I'm going to talk about, that you still need face-to-face contact. You still need people to have an actual voice in the room, so to speak. The way they did it was a consensus of folks in big parks. You've probably all seen Washington Square Park with the big arch. You know, a lot of their meetings were there. And anybody and everybody that wanted to speak could speak. And they do it by way of what's called stacking, which you literally line up, and who wants to speak can speak through the microphone and such and get a consensus back from the audience. They use something called progressive stacking, which is that for marginalized groups, so essentially minorities and women, they actually were given preference to skip the line up so that the discussion wasn't dominated by white men, frankly. So that's how they operated by consensus and then deciding what they were going to do. The thing is that it was like a flame that flickered out fairly quickly. It was emotion-driven, mostly dominated by young people and then joined by representatives of the middle class and such, and people really feeling disaffected. But they had no clear message, which I think is also one thing that we can learn from that. There was no list of demands, no give us this or we're going to stay in this park forever kind of a thing. They were simply angry. And I think that possibly was the message. It's been seen widely by a number of people as a failure because they didn't really accomplish anything. I frankly beg to differ with that. I think that there was something that has come out of that. Always when you inspire people to actually react and act, it does reverberate. As Michael said, the example of the young lady, 16 years old, which I always wonder, why isn't she in school? That's always my thing. But she's doing something, and people respond to when you do something that inspires others to get out there and act. Many commentators now think that in the long run, this is what revitalized kind of the socialist part of the Democratic Party, which, by the way, in the U.S., as you must know, there really are two parties since the Civil War that dominate at least the main. Have a grip. So really you're talking about the influence within those parties to influence. So it's animated folks like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, some of the things that you hear coming out of the current presidential run, the free college for everyone, $15 minimum wage, climate change, a lot of that you can trace back to what was being said during the Occupy Wall Street era. Okay, now, the other movement going on about the same time frame, the Tea Party movement. Have you all heard of the Tea Party movement? Tea Partiers sometimes dress in kind of odd outfits, but they came about in 2009, and they were right after President Obama was elected, and had some very unhappy people and probably some nervous people who are wondering what's going to happen. Are we going to be too liberal with our spending policies, moving towards more of a socialist type of a governance? So a reporter actually was the one that called for a Tea Party against the Obama agenda. And that's what started it and mobilizing people. Now, what they're all for, they had a more definite message and set of shared values than the Occupy Wall Street folks. They are for less governance, more personal liberties, less tax, certainly. So you know who this attracted? This is pretty much people that are maybe not in the top 1%, but they're certainly not middle class. They're more of just, courts. So very much, let's go back to what was George Washington thinking? What would Benjamin Franklin have done? That's the Tea Party kind of concept. They have had tremendous success, and why? They've also relied on social media, but again, not primarily. Their success has been on the local level. So they organize in local groups as part of the Tea Party platforms, and have had great impact on local issues, which are extraordinarily important. That's where you're going to get your land use planning. That's where you're going to get property taxes. That's what you're going to get, all of those things. They have also met regularly, which is unusual for a social movement, that they have regular, like sometimes in places, weekly meetings. And they've used that opportunity not only to share information on discrete issues, but they have also taken the opportunity to educate their followers on how to be activists within the system. So a hard example would be on the local level, if there's an issue that we are in disagreement with or in agreement with, here's how you form a phone tree, for example. Here's who you need to call. They have a system set up in place. Using that as their base of operations, what they've been able to do, and I think it's rather brilliant, I don't know if they planned it or it's just happened, but they've run their own people in the Republican Party. So they have risen up, the Tea Party folks, and essentially taken over the structure of the Republican Party. They haven't had to be their own party. They're called a Tea Party, but that's not a political party. So they haven't had to have their own recognized infrastructure to run their candidates. They have taken over at least parts of the Republican Party to press their agenda, and it's been very transformative and felt in a number of ways, not only with who's being put into office, but who's on the court system. Things like the Federalist Society have burgeoned, and people with particular ideologies that are closely aligned, like adhering strictly to the Constitution as written, now those people are on the bench. So they have enjoyed tremendous success within the existing system. So what are the lessons learned? One, organization is key for these social movements to have lasting impact, at least lasting direct impact on whatever the politics are of the country and on the governance, at least in my opinion. The best example, of course, is the Tea Party walking into that established structure and then being able to push their agenda within the established structure of the Republican Party. The Occupy Wall Street folks, on the other hand, while not having that lasting direct impact without the specific message, took it another way, inspiring folks and getting people within, again, the established parties, in their case, the Democrats, to shift policy more towards the left, more towards the more socialist type ideas. And that's where you get the Bernie Sanders, the Elizabeth Warrens, et cetera, and their popularity. They've also been an example to other movements who have kind of combined the ideas of more concrete demands with action. In my own state of Arizona, we're frankly one of the poorer states in the U.S., and we don't fund education well. We are always duking it out for 49th or 50th in terms of how much money we pay teachers and how much we put into education, because we just don't have the money. So the teachers, last 2 years ago, simply walked out statewide. They all dressed in red and occupied the Capitol area, which coincidentally is outside my window. And it was a stirring sight to see tens of thousands of people descending on the Capitol, because they also brought their kids and such. It was not these were educated the teachers, and refused to go back to work, had a list of concrete demands. Well, what happened, of course, they were able to negotiate and got what they want peacefully, but by doing that, they were the nicest group of folks, and they were thrilled to be out there. You know, Americans love to occupy things and march and that kind of thing. So it can work that way. Another lesson, I think, are those visuals, those 99%, the teachers were red for ed, wearing red. All of those visuals and the numbers of people inevitably influence the existing leaders to take note. And one last thing is, if you are a social movement comprised of people most likely to vote, which are the teachers, yes, most likely to vote, you have more impact versus the Wall Street folks. Young people, somewhat disaffected, less likely to vote, less impact. So those are, you can go on and on, but those are some of the lessons that I wanted to bring out and bring to your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and you've done extremely well in packing two examples which bring out different lessons in the space of 10 minutes. So without further delay, I think the idea was to try and have a dialogue around these issues. You might have specific questions for the panelists, but we will also like to hear your own ideas around these particular questions. So I will open it up. We have about 1 hour for discussion. Please take about 3 minutes to frame your issue, and then each person will get about 2 times, and we have more time. We will come back to you a third time if you still have questions. So it's now open to you. Please. You need a microphone? Here? And I apologize, I might not be able to call you by name because my eyesight is very poor even with the aids that I have. But hopefully that's understandable.
Hello. Is this on now? Yes. Thank you. Warren Newman, lawyer by training, but also a background in political science. And listening to both of you this morning, the three of you actually, brought back memories of Max Weber and his attempt to plot the rise of social movements and systematize the nature of the dynamic of social movements, moving through charismatic leadership and idealism to careerism and the like. And in Canada, we've had agrarian protest movements, both on the left and on the right, in the western provinces of Canada, that began as social movements, social credit on the right, the Canadian Commonwealth Federation on the left. We now have the New Democratic Party, we had the Reform Party. Again, they transformed into political parties to advance their ideas. But I have a couple of questions perhaps for both of you. How do we differentiate between social movements, and of course we know what political parties are, and special interest groups or lobbyists, simply, that is, who are coalescing around a few ideas and want to influence, but they're not what we would call a generalized social movement. They essentially are advancing special interests. And with your examples, Madam Justice, Timmer, was the Me Too phenomenon a social movement, a protest movement? Is there a way to flesh out, moving from simple dynamics of protests that are manifested in a very visible way to something that is really what we would term a social movement that has a lasting impact? Thank you.
Okay, other contributions? We will keep the questions and the speakers will, towards the end, come back with their own reflections on the contributions as well as the questions.
Yeah, hi, my name is Jeff Staten. I'm a political scientist at Emory University in Atlanta. I wanted to follow up on Justice Timmer's presentation as well, and just maybe put on the table the question of leadership. My interpretation of Occupy Wall Street is like maybe just a slightly different than the one you'd put on it. First is, I think it's helpful to compare it to the 15M movement in Spain, which predates it, and it's really part of the same global movement of young people. The particular issue is like, what would have happened to the movement in Spain had there not been professors in Spain who had decided to form a political party? And what I see in the Occupy Wall Street movement is not so much that they didn't have clear demands, they just didn't have a leadership structure. Indeed, they were committed to not having one. And that's what you're seeing with the Bernie phenomenon, is like what happens to that movement when you put some leadership behind it. So I'm just interested in your reflections on that. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Any other contributions? We also have a set of difficult questions that I will
popular attention of folks and kind of taken out of the closet, so to speak. And that's how I at least viewed the Me Too movement, and to start the discussions, and it sure did. People are discussing it. It made people react to it. I can tell you from my own, I'm on the Supreme Court. We manage the court system in Arizona. So almost immediately, the leadership in the courts talk about, my gosh, is this kind of thing go on in our court system? Probably. So immediately we're going to have training on this. Immediately we're going to have discourse on this and that kind of a thing. And that's a lot of what Me Too did. I think Occupy Wall Street, same thing. It was a protest. There was no clear message of what we want done. It was simply, we're angry about this. This is a problem, and bringing it to folks. As far as the difference between social movements and lobbyists, I think they're not mutually exclusive. When you have a social movement like climate change, different organizations then hire lobbyists, because again, it's one thing to have a social movement and to bring demands out there, to have anger expressed, those kinds of things. But you need to find a way, as the gentleman had said, to be within an organization to actually accomplish change. One of the ways you can do that is to hire lobbyists who are experienced and know what they're doing with dealing with the legislative bodies. Some say maybe have, frankly, too much influence. And certainly, I see it at the local capital and our state capital all the time, and I think in the country as well, that the bigger the companies that maybe don't want climate change initiatives, environmental issues, because it's against their bottom line profits, can hire armies of lobbyists to deal with the legislation. And those people might be contributing. I mean, that's a continuous problem we see. It was touched on yesterday with money and politics. It all goes together. As far as what you were saying about the Occupy Wall Street, and again, some say it's a failure. I don't think that was a failure, because I think it sparked things. And you're right. This movement's have been going on for way before any of us were born, for centuries. It's how women in the U.S. got the vote. and how women nationally, it wasn't just they woke up one day and thought, well, let's give women the vote. It had to be women out there pushing for it and marching and occupying, so to speak, to get these things done. So I do think that you did touch on a good point, though, lack of leadership, which I think it was purposeful for Occupy Wall Street. I'm not sure that they really planned on getting anything done in terms of just starting the ball rolling towards where they are now. Now we see people like, can never pronounce her name, Alexandria Cortez, AOC, out of New York, young woman who's not even 30, and is causing all kinds of conversation around some of the social issues that started really, at least in modern times, with that occupation.
Michael, did you want to say anything before we go back to the audience?
Well, thank you. Well, Anne gave a very good answer. But given the question, how do we see the difference between lobbyists and the social movements? We've discussed that a lot in Sweden, and we came down to it's all about the profits, basically. If it's all the people wanting something which is not for profit, then it's a social movement. If it's in it for the profits, then it's a lobbyist organization, basically, to put it very, very simply. And then, as Anne said, of course, you can use PR relations to get help with getting your message out there, of course. But that doesn't have to necessarily mean that it's a part of a lobbyist organization just because you need help. And what happens with social movements if they don't form into political parties? Well, I would say most of the social movements focus on a single question, on just one question that is important to them. And when they've kind of reached their goal, they don't need to be a social movement anymore. Since, on the other hand, we have a political party, then you have to have a broad spectrum on your policies with an opinion on everything from climate change to preschool. And that would be the big difference between them, I guess. So if you want to turn a social movement into a political party, you have to make sure you have policies all over the entire spectra. Thank you.
Any contributions from the floor? Yes, Justice?
Thank you very much. My name is Jairus Nga. I come from Kenya. Mine is just a comment, and it is this, that social movements may not necessarily be alternative to political parties. More often than not, they arise because some issue has arisen, and they'll always coalesce around that issue, so that they will remain relevant as long as that issue has not been resolved. More often, again than not, you'll find that whatever they do influences the decision of either the government in place or even the political parties themselves, or if it is around an electioneering period, that issue will influence how people are going to vote. And at times, these social movements morph into political parties, depending on how influential they are around that particular issue. Speaking of my own country, Kenya, sometimes in 1992, we had a social movement, because at that time, political parties we were a single party state. And therefore, we had a social movement that arose. It called itself Forum for Restoration of Democracy. Now, many people came around it and pressured the government into changing the constitution so that political parties could now be allowed multi-party democracy. They succeeded, and what initially was a pressure group in the name of Forum for Restoration of Democracy now became a party called FORD, Forum for Restoration of Democracy, as a political party. So this is a clear case where now a pressure group or a social movement morphs itself into a political party. But was that the end of other social movements coming up? No. In fact, after that party came into place, there were other social movements that arose much later, showing that, yes, we might have political parties, but we still also need social movements, which in a way act as an oversight, not only to the government, but also to the political parties to influence the way they operate and the decisions they make. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justice.
Muchas gracias. Es el Chávez de Perú. Es de reconocer y felicitar la preocupación esta que nos reúne y que se trata de aspectos centrales. Pero yo vengo percibiendo de que nosotros queremos tácitamente dar por entendido de que existen instituciones como el caso del partido político, pero no definimos qué es un partido político. ¿Cómo es posible que un movimiento social pase a ser un partido político? ¿Qué concepto tenemos de partido político? Y ahí nos vamos a dar cuenta que un partido político, para ser tal, tiene que tener ideología, o sea, sustento teórico y filosófico. Los movimientos sociales son espontáneos, son turbas, eventuales, pero no son partidos políticos. El partido político, además de ideología, tiene que tener vida orgánica, normada, reglamentada. Por eso ayer se hablaba, por ejemplo, de los allegados a los partidos políticos. Eso se da para matar a los partidos políticos porque no tienen una estructura orgánica funcional que diga cómo se organiza, cómo funciona, cuáles son sus deberes, cuáles son sus derechos. Además, los partidos políticos tienen que tener su jerarquía organizativa, quiénes son sus líderes, quiénes son sus militantes, quiénes son sus amigos. Porque si no tenemos un concepto claro de lo que es un partido político, vamos pues a tener el riesgo de cualquier movimiento que surja por ahí, se atribuye la característica de ser un partido político y obviamente lo más próximo que tenemos pues tener de inmediato es una agencia de corrupción y también su autoeliminación como organizaciones políticas, como está sucediendo particularmente en mi país, por ejemplo. La gente, los jóvenes sobre todo, no creen en los partidos políticos, ¿no es cierto? Porque los partidos políticos se han convertido en cúpulas de poder y no solamente políticas, sino hasta familiares. Hay familias que se entronan en el poder, forman una organización y todo lo demás tiene que hablar alrededor de sus propuestas y de sus voluntades. Yo, en conclusión, yo sugeriría que, primero, para decir si un movimiento social puede convertirse en partido, hay que definir bien, taxativamente, qué cosa es un partido político, cuáles son los requisitos para que sea partido político, cuál es su programa. Entonces, eso es todo. Gracias.
Other contributions? And even reflecting on the questions that have just been raised about how do we define political parties, are social movements now a threat to political party regimes? If I try to paraphrase the last speaker. Any contributions behind?
This is Hari Puyal, a judge in the Supreme Court of Nepal. This is just to inform this forum that we also do have social movements have taken a shape of the political party. Actually, one of the party, the Forum for Madheshi Janadhikar group, ethnic groups representing ethnic groups, turned a political party and now is the coalition to the ruling government party. And there are other social movements. Basically, the NGO, non-governmental organization workers came together and formed an alliance, and they made a political party, and they bring some issues like climate change, environment protections, or other social justice issues. And they are rising up gradually, and they are seen as a threat by the mainstream political parties that their stake is being taken away. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think that there are a number of speakers who reinforce some of the earlier comments made about how social movements have, in essence, also pushed the political party regime systems and improvements in political parties, whether it's the example of the Democratic Party of the United States, my brother from Kenya who's talked about how this has also influenced. But I do have a question that is also worth reflecting on as we go along, that the internal mechanism and workings of political parties insofar as advancing political and electoral rights is concerned has also been a part of dissatisfaction and distrust in political parties. So if you think, for instance, in terms of political party nominations and the extent to which citizens feel that political parties can provide and execute that electoral function, providing opportunity for them to exercise their right to be elected to public office, and the breakdowns in that has partly fueled this. The Kenya example that I heard my brother talked about relates to the fact that the political party system was not as developed. As a matter of fact, it was a fairly closed political system. And so the movement, in other words, provided the only opportunity for political participation in that particular context, distinguished from, for example, the examples we've had from the US, where the political party system is fairly open, but there are very strong issues that political parties either don't address or that citizens mobilize around themselves better to make demands. So as we think through this, I think the question that we need to keep reflecting on is, from a legal perspective, what do we do with these social movements? How do we foster the ability for them to be able to formally participate, if that is a desirous goal, because I've had others worry that it actually might be a threat to political party regimes. At the back.
Hi, David from Mexico. I guess when we try to have this dichotomy of political parties and social movements, the line that I believe we need to draw is where the political party's responsibility finishes and when the market can actually be an escape valve for those social movements. If the movement addresses something that has to influence government, let's say education, let's say housing, etc., maybe a political party is the right choice to get a hold of this movement. But if the movement address, or security, for example, in the Me Too movement, but if the movement has other concerns, maybe the market can be an alternative for them to go and try to solve these problems. Because at the end, what we are facing is social issues. And I would like to maybe reflect if there is even a third alternative, which doesn't come to my mind. But here we have political parties through democratic institutions, but also we have companies that can solve social movements, or they can eventually get a hold of a social movement and maybe address the issue. Let's say mobility. If the government wanted in the 19th century to address mobility, maybe they would have bought more horses, as Henry Ford said. But the idea of a company trying to come up with innovation to solve these issues, I think sometimes can be a better option. Just a question to reflect and just live in the area that maybe we have other options than political parties.
Okay. At the back.
Thank you. Is it working? The other one? Is it working?
Yeah. Yes.
Just a question before I make my comment. Is the French translation working? Can I speak French? Oui. Encore une fois, je suis soucieux de défendre la langue française dans les instances internationales, même si je n'aurais pas de problème à m'exprimer en anglais ou en espagnol. Je souhaite faire un bref commentaire. Je vous prie de m'excuser de ne pas avoir pu assister à l'ensemble de l'atelier. Devant faire la synthèse demain de cette session du matin, je navigue entre les trois. Je voulais apporter un retour d'expérience sur les partis politiques en France et éventuellement avec un regard aussi sur l'Italie. Comme vous le savez...
Moment, excusez-moi, is the French translation working?
Please translate it to Spanish, that's the problem. These of you don't speak.
Apparently...
You will have to probably repeat your comments. Well, when we get the thumbs up, we'll be ready to go, so we'll just wait.
Entonces, ¿cuál es el problema?
Maybe it's a different channel.
For English is number 1 and for French is number 2.
¿Para español?
So number 1 is English and number 2 is French. Okay.
Or Spanish.
Can you put on so we can test it?
Okay, please test. Okay, apologies for that. If you can try again and we see whether the translation now works. So you probably will have to start all over again.
Yeah, that's not a problem. Just like that,
You're waiting for
everyone
the
can understand what I'm saying. Entonces, en espagnol, para el español está bien. Si je parle français, est-ce qu'il y a la traduction du français à l'anglais? Oui?
Okay.
Est-ce que la traduction du français à l'anglais fonctionne? Do you have
No,
the translation in English?
no.
No.
I can switch to German if it's
German?
more to German, yeah, if it's more efficient.
Bitte schön. Okay, so if you can switch to any other language and we see whether it will work, if you're proficient enough.
Bueno, voy a hablar en español entonces. Sí, solo un comentario sobre la experiencia francesa e italiana, sobre la cuestión de los movimientos sociales y la evolución en partidos políticos. Seguramente todos han escuchado sobre los chalecos amarillos en Francia, que es principalmente un movimiento social, que no tiene existencia política y no tiene tampoco existencia sindical. Y eso estaba el problema lo más grande para manejar, gestionar los chalecos amarillos, porque no tenían una estructura, no tenían una persona, un interlocutor con el cual hablar y saber las reivindicaciones, saber cuándo, cómo, dónde van a protestar, a manifestar, para canalizar el movimiento, y por todo eso había ese problemas por el Estado, por la policía, por la seguridad, de canalizar y de manejar ese movimiento. Pero ese movimiento no tiene existencia política, tiene existencia solamente social en la sociedad. Ha tenido una existencia política desde el momento en el cual se presentó a elecciones, las elecciones europeas del 26 de mayo en Francia. Presentándose a las elecciones, haciendo listas como candidatos, se volvieron en partidos políticos. Y el problema específico de los chalecos amarillos es que habían varios partidos políticos, varias listas presentadas como representantes del movimiento de los chalecos amarillos. Ahora, segundo elemento. En el 2017 fue electo el presidente Emmanuel Macron. Seguramente todos han escuchado de él también. Emmanuel Macron se presentó como un candidato afuera de los partidos, con un nuevo movimiento que ha llamado En Camino, En Marche. Pero ese movimiento presentado como algo diferente de un partido, se volvió inmediatamente como un partido el más clásico del mundo. La única diferencia fue que estaba más rápido. Somos a la era digital, a la era de la 4, de la 5G, todo es más rápido, la construcción de un partido político también. Antes se necesitaban 10, 15, 20 años para construir un partido y llegar a la presidencia de la República. Emmanuel Macron lo hizo en un año. Pero es exactamente el mismo procedimiento. Construir una asociación, una agregación de gente que comparten una ideología para permitir a una persona determinada de llegar en un sitio determinado después de un momento indeterminado. 1, 5, 10, 20 años. Pero todos los presidentes de la República Francesa han hecho lo mismo. Sea Jacques Chirac, sea Nicolas Sarkozy, sea François Mitterrand, sea Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. El único quizás que fue diferente estaba Charles de Gaulle, porque es el primero presidente. ¿Qué quiero decir con todo eso? Ahora concluyo. Es que tenemos una pérdida de confianza en las instituciones y en los partidos políticos. Pero los partidos políticos se quedan indispensables. Hasta que no hay otro elemento de sustitución que todavía no existe, yo no lo encontré. Hasta que no hay otro elemento estructural de sustitución a los partidos políticos, se quedan. Se puede decir todo lo que se quiere, vamos a hacer algo diferente, siempre o se vuelve a un partido político clásico, el ejemplo de En Camino de Macron, el ejemplo del movimiento 5 estrellas en Italia, que es exactamente lo mismo, que se presentó como algo diferente, un movimiento, tiene el nombre, Movimiento 5 estrellas, que pero se queda como un partido político. O la otra solución es que no va a tener existencia en el sistema institucional democrático institucional. Se quedará en la sociedad como un movimiento, pero sin estructura, sin existencia efectiva. Y por eso los movimientos sociales son importantes, pero desde el momento que quieran representación, implicación en las instituciones políticas, se vuelven en partidos políticos. Gracias.
Merci. I think you've also brought a very good example of the Yellow Jacket movement. Before I proceed, because this is meant to be a discussion, I will allow you to have the microphone. Microphone, please.
Right, thank you. My name is George Evans. I'm from the United Kingdom. And in the UK, we have a lot of single-issue political parties. We have, at the moment, you may have heard of an issue called Brexit, which is dominating the political landscape at the moment. And we also have the Women's Equality Party. And I think, the Green Party as well would have started off as a single-issue political party, which has now sort of broadened its base and is now much more, has a broader focus anyway. So increasingly, I think, and I would say that increasingly, I think single issues can dominate the political landscape. And actually, it would depend on sort of how a social movement might be able to affect change most effectively. Now, Extinction Rebellion is also quite a famous UK social movement at the moment, focusing on the climate crisis. And they see themselves, they aren't going to use the route of political parties. I'd be very surprised if they did. And they're sort of sitting outside. So essentially, I think I'm not sure that I agree that to be a political party, you need to have this broad base of policies. Actually, it could just be seen as a sort of tool to achieve your objectives.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Great. First, an example from my own country, which is Kenya. We had a very interesting phenomenon with respect to independent candidates. Because of how citizens, prefer to participate in politics, independent candidates generally found it very challenging to stand on their own. Citizens were looking and demanding for organized political structures. And so it was very interesting to see then what independent candidates did. They will gather themselves and form a party of independent candidates, right? So an amalgamation of different independent candidates, but taking on the structure, the form of a political party. Now, the question that I have for the participants is, particularly those from Latin America, the argument I've had in my neck of the woods, which is Africa, is that part of the weakness in political party regime stems from the fact that they are weak social movements. I think the proposition there is that, and the example is given of Latin America, that social movements have really played a role in advancing and strengthening the political party regimes. So I would like to hear more about what you think of that, what has been the experience in Latin America, and what lessons we can borrow from that, particularly, if they are similar to what I heard Justice Tima talk about, the sense that Occupy Wall Street and even the Tea movement have really taken an active role in pushing the frontiers of how political parties get seized and advance issues in their formal politics. So I'll be more than willing and happy to invite some reflections from Latin America, particularly for our brothers from Africa, where this question has been raised again and again about weak political party regimes as a consequence of lack of strong social movements. Anybody? Any takers? Yes, please. Do I need to repeat? Yeah, can you repeat the question, please? Yeah, so in Africa, some of our friends who are visiting and who've lived in Latin America have suggested that the weak political parties there and the overall weak political party regime is partly driven by the fact that there are no strong social movements. And one of the examples they keep citing and is saying that in Latin America, strong social movements have driven political parties to try and seize of issues, to organize themselves better, with the result of having stronger political party regimes. So, in other words, I think they are arguing that there's a positive effect to the existence of social movements for political parties. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about that experience and your own thoughts on that. Yeah, right there. Okay, and then we'll come to you. Okay, at the back, right at the back.
My name is Ingrid Bicu. I'm a member of the Electoral Authority of Romania, and I'm currently seconded to International IDEA, but I do have quite a few years within the Romanian Election Commission. So, yeah, we have a very particular landscape, let's say, right now, and unfortunately, I don't know how it happens in some other countries, but there always has to be a reason. In Romania, all the social movements have been generated by a tragedy lately. We either had, let's say, an accident where 70 people died, and then from there, there has been an intense research, and people realized that the corruption was the reason why those people couldn't be treated correctly and addressed, and then from that point on, tens of thousands of people went out on the streets. We had recently a few cases of women trafficking that led again to some networks of authorities involved in this kind of activities, and again corruption, which led again to people going out on the streets and to these social movements being organized. And the pressure, and I think the most important, let's say, gathering of this type was, and was also the biggest after the Romanian after the Romanian Revolution, actually, that changed the regime from the communists to democracy. And it has been in 2018 when the ruling political party had the intention of disincriminating corruption. So, at least in Romania, and I think it's something very specific to Latin America and not only to emerging democracies in general, corruption is what actually generates social movements in a way due to its consequences. And the pressure that the street could put on political parties was huge, because eventually those legislations, those laws were not adopted anymore. And governments were changed, and indeed the opposition was stimulated to be more active. So yes, it happened in my country also, and I think at the end of the day it could be there are advantages of this kind of new gathering of people. The point is that another consequence was again the establishment of a new political party who, as the case of France was, well, without violence, of course, but they managed to get into the parliament a few months after they were established. So this is to be discussed and to be analyzed. To what extent is it a good thing? It is a bad thing? We need this kind of newness in the political landscape, or we don't? Thank you very much for the intervention.
Okay, we are soon coming to a close. You want the microphone? Yes, please.
The good thing is that I don't belong to any organisms that I can speak freely. So I believe that the case in Mexico is somewhat special in the sense that we had one political party ruling for over 70 years, and that political party was ruthless. If you spoke against it, you will disappear in the sea. Actually in 1968, the political party took out the tanks against students. So starting in 2000, when we started having more democratic movements, especially when that political party got out of government, sadly it got back 12 years later, but now it's out again, which speaks of the democracy that we are living. That gave rise to social movements. And I can think at least 4 social movements in the past 20 years that come to my mind. 3 of them made by, 2 of them made by students, one in UNAM in early 2000s. The second was Yo Soy 43, 134, 132. Yo Soy 132, which was also a student movement. And we also have movements driven by huge strategy, like the killing of 43 students that happened a couple of years ago, and we are still trying to find them. And the feminist movement, which I think got influenced by a global movement that I think is going to the right direction, and we still need to force it. So I believe that these 2 consequences, having a really, really strong political party that will not allow dissidents, and then going to democracy, but with an eroded confidence of on the political parties was the trigger that actually started to allow us to have social movements. It is, to be honest, something quite new for us.
Okay. As we draw to a close, I'll probably throw back one question to the wisdom, collective wisdom in this room. How do formal institutions in elections, so we are talking about election commissions, we are talking about groups like the Tribunal in Mexico, relate to these social movements? Is it worth a discussion, or should we leave it as it is, that we will always have political parties? There are clear ways in which relationships are defined by law between parties and other formal institutions of elections, and social movements sort of exist outside of that. If they choose to participate in elections, they either have to come as independent candidates or they have to transform themselves into formal political parties. Or is there any conversation that we should be having around how to structure law so that they can define the relationship between social movements and authorities? Any takers on that particular question? Yes?
Yeah, sure. I would say that it's probably the job of political parties to try to take on the concerns of these social movements and kind of negate their necessity, so that political parties need to be listening to citizens and also social movements so that they can assume those issues. And again, I guess, and in terms of sort of other institutions like the Electoral Tribunal, I think they would then be transformed by political parties. I think that would probably be how that would work. I don't think the Electoral Tribunal has time to listen to all of the social movements, but I think it's the job of political parties to do so.
Any other views on that?
Hi, I am Pablo from Mexico, from the Electoral Tribunal. And now that David was talking about social movements in Mexico, it came to my mind, of course, in '94, the ZLN, which was a very important social movement that took place in a very iconic moment in Mexico, where neoliberal politics were implemented. And it was a very huge social movement, which its basic agenda was pushing and trying to recognize indigenous rights. And it happened a curious thing. Of course, it got international relevance. And because of that, it ended up in a constitutional article, this movement, an article that recognized the indigenous rights. But what I was thinking is that it can be tricky. Being recognized in law, it stopped the social movement because you can think, or at least the force of that social movement, because you can think that, okay, we took our social demands to the Constitution, now that's it. But I think that an important factor of social demands, it takes place in time, you know, like the effectivity of that law, because it's what happened. It now is recognized in the Constitution, but I can say that the situation of indigenous communities in Mexico, it's still the same that it was back then. So, in conclusion, I would say that recognizing in law the demands of a social movement sometimes is not enough to take those demands to reality. No, so that would be.
Any last contribution from this side before I invite the speakers to make some concluding remarks and thoughts? Well, there's none. So I think the balance of opinion in the room, if I summarize well, and if I've apprehended all the contributions well, is that political parties still will continue to exist. All the distrusts, disaffection, and concerns about them notwithstanding, they still represent, in the view of the majority of this room, the structured way for citizens to participate in politics and to advance their political and electoral rights. At the same time, I think there is recognition within this room that social movements play a positive role, particularly in terms of the ability to listen, aggregate, and advance specific demands that resonate very well with citizens, and that oftentimes even taking those demands to push the frontiers of development of political party regimes and how political parties work, and at best, in other instances, transforming themselves into political parties that then advance these issues. So I would like to invite the speakers to now make some concluding remarks and to also challenge them to reflect a little bit on the last question, which related to how formal institutions of elections should relate to social movements. Justice Tima, you've had a very distinguished career in law, and so I think it is something that you might have thought about. What are the legal implications or what are the effects on law and how it is practiced and how informal institutions created by law are structured when they deal with these informal groups and networks such as social movements?
Does this work or do I need, does mine work? Or you're able to hear, all right, then I'll use this then. Well, interesting question, and I was also, I'm going to circumvent it a bit because I also want to comment on some of the excellent points that some folks made and also questions asked. So I'm going to see if I can wrap it up by making just a few points. One, I think that someone was saying about that, this gentleman was saying that sometimes, especially the younger people, don't have the respect or believe in political parties, and yet I think the consensus of the room is that political parties are a must. You need that organization, and inevitably, even any social movement that organizes is going to, by de facto, be a political party. The criticism that a lot of people have about some of the movements, as in France, I think, with the Yellow Vest, and some of the other social movements that are truly disruptive, even Occupy Wall Street, is it really is using anarchist-type tactics. And anarchy is a scary word, but anarchist-type things are being embraced. And I think that the concern that's reflected in this room and that we should think about is how it might end up being this democratic dissatisfaction in that people don't want to adhere to democracy anymore, preferring to use anarchist tactics that don't ultimately result in working within the structure. And I throw that out. The gentleman back from Mexico, you mentioned that the market can be an alternative. Absolutely. And I think that we do see that with a concrete example in the US. Large companies push social reforms. They say to their lawyers, we're not going to let you represent us unless we see that your team of lawyers reflects our society. So you better have women actively involved. You better have minorities actively involved and at the table. That, going to a corporation's bottom line has really caused tremendous amount of reform that wouldn't have happened through the political process. Also, unfortunately, in my view, in my country, people are bypassing now government to get some social reforms. They've learned, let's go to the courts, and that's where I see it. They're coming to the courts saying that this is how we had the right to same-sex marriage in the country. It wasn't a matter of legislation. It was a matter of the court system saying you have to do it under our Constitution. The same with the civil rights desegregation back in the 50s. All of that goes through the courts which is giving courts a lot of power and starting to cause people maybe sometimes to distrust the courts because it's a lot of power. But that's kind of where it's gone. Also, the gentleman from France was talking about political parties can be built on social movements can be result in a party quickly. I think for those of you with countries with a very short campaign time, I think that that's more likely, that you can have that spark that I talked about, that emotion, and it can quickly steamroll into true action and a political party in a way that I don't think can happen in countries like the US, where I don't think they ever stop campaigning. It's just always going on. So it's a slow-moving train there. My last point, I think that two points, that I do agree with, he's walked out, no, you're back there from the UK, that single message absolutely can work. And I was in Scotland in 2014 with the yes, no, and boy, that resonated, yes, no. And I guess you'd call that a social movement of Scotland trying to leave and having that very clear message. People could understand that and get on side, and I think that's important for any social movement. You understand precisely what you want, you're going to have more of an opportunity to get it done. And finally, people were saying that people distrust political parties, and I'm going to end on saying something controversial about that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, frankly. I think distrust is healthy. Not anarchy and just simply dispensing with them and the corruption. You don't want that, but distrust is a healthy thing, because what it does is it spurs conversation, it causes people to be watchdogs on their political process, it causes alternate forms of political parties or social interests to form. If you are so trusting with your political party system that you become passive and you turn a blind eye, that's when bad things happen. So distrust is not something to fear or to try to tamp down on, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, your concluding remarks in 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you all for a very interesting discussion and very, very valuable input. Social movements are an important part of a functioning democracy, and it's just as important as political parties, if you ask me. They act as a way in for the people in case political parties fail to either with their politics or to raise the issues that people want politicians to talk about. However, as Ingrid from Romania mentions, it is common for social movements to be based on the fact that a tragedy has occurred or that something negative is going on in society. Not always, but often. This does not necessarily have to be the case for a political party that can be formed on completely different reasons. A clear example from Sweden is the right to vote for women, which was introduced in 1921. That probably would not have happened if it wouldn't have been for the social movements, at least not until much later. Then this continued as a party that developed their politics with a continuing focus on influence, equality, human rights, and so on. In Sweden, two parties have dominated Swedish politics for over 100 years, but since the 1980s and partly thanks to the social movements, there are today 9 parties in Sweden's parliament with 3, if not 4, dominant parties out of these. Social movements are in some sense need to protect democracy, that is my assessment. This is something of an examining force of the established parties and a way for the public to try to steer the politician to at least raise a relevant issue on the agenda. Social movements and political parties do not necessarily have to be in contrast with each other, but more as a complement to ensuring democracy in a modern society. And today it's much easier for social movements to succeed thanks to the internet and alternative channels for obtaining information. As mentioned during this discussion, social movements usually work around an individual issue as opposed to a political party that hopefully works with a more complete spectrum of issues. And this is needed when a party cannot stop and focus on an individual issue in the same way. If you do as such as UKIP in the UK, which was mentioned in the discussion, then the party loses its purpose and probably also its votes when it reaches its goal. So what I mean, if you want to continue as a political party after achieving your goal as a single issue party, then you need to develop and broaden to justify your own existence. Besides the common question, the people who are a part of a social movement can have completely different political values and thus could never cooperate on other issues. And in this situation, social movements, according to me, is the only alternative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's put our hands together for the two speakers. I think they have done excellently well in guiding the discussion and providing for us food for us to continue thinking as the conference goes on. It is now 11:05, so we want to stop there. We've compensated for the time we lost when there was a translation breakdown. I want to turn it back to the facilitators. Is there any administrative announcement, or should we just go for tea and then to the next session? Recess for 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Enjoy your tea.